Well, thanks for joining me again for our study in the book of Isaiah. As we get started, let me ask you a question. Do you know that kids will tell you the truth? You think, well, sometimes mine don't, but in reality, we know our kids will tell us the truth, sometimes in ways that we don't appreciate. For example, maybe you are teaching your kid that maybe you shouldn't say certain words or a certain word for a little one, and then one day you say that word, and guess what? Your kid's going to call you out. See, he has expectations that he's going to put on you because you put expectations on him. Maybe you're trying to teach a kid to act a certain way. Maybe you say, we don't act that way in public, or we don't do this type of thing in the grocery store. And then one day maybe you act like that, or you treat somebody the way you're trying to teach them not to. And guess what? They call you out on it. Because when we place expectations on them, they put expectations on us. And today we're going to talk about some expectations that God has for the people of Israel and how he expects them to act, and he calls them out when they don't act that way. Look in your personal study guide on page 109. It says here, the one true God is just. He expects his people to demonstrate their faith through right living. So today we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 58, and we're going to see God's expectations. And remember, Isaiah is speaking to a people before they're sent into exile about what that exile means and what it means for them in the future. So look with me now at Isaiah chapter 58, verses 1 through 5. And I want you to listen for the difference between what God sees and what the people are thinking. Cry out loudly, don't hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Tell my people their transgressions and the house of Jacob their sins. They seek me day after day and delight to know my ways, like a nation that does what is right and does not abandon the justice of their God. They ask me for righteous judgments, and they delight in the nearness of God. Why have we fasted, but you have not seen? We have denied ourselves, but you haven't noticed. Look, you do as you please on the first day of your fast and oppress all your workers. You fast with contention and strife to strike viciously with your fist. You cannot fast as you do today, hoping to make your voice heard on high. Will the fast I choose be like this? A day for a person to deny himself, to bow his head like a reed, and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast and a day acceptable to the Lord? Now, if we just read this passage without thinking, if we just read through it real fast and didn't stop to consider what's happening, we might get the wrong idea what's going on here. We might have a misunderstanding of what God is trying to say. You see in verse 1, God tells Isaiah to remind the people of their sins, saying, remind them that they have transgressed, that they have not done what I expect them to do. And then in verse 2, it seems that he extols them for their righteous living. So we might get a little tongue-tied there and say, what's God talking about? What's going on here? And I think there are two things to help us understand what's going on. The first issue is a translation issue. Verse 2, a literal translation might begin with the word yet. So think of it like this. Tell my people their transgressions and the house of Israel their sins, yet they seek me day after day and delight to know my ways. The second issue, it might be understood best if we understand that God's using a little bit of sarcasm here when he talks to his people. Let's go back to the text. Yet they seek me day after day and delight in knowing my ways, like a nation that does what is right. There is a mismatch between what God expects and what they're doing. And there's also a mismatch between what they expect and what God does. Verse 3 tells us, why have we fasted, but you have not seen? Why have we denied ourselves, but you haven't noticed? So Isaiah is telling these people who act like a people who seek God that really they are sinning against God. And the people respond and say, no, God, we are people who seek you. We are people who do the things you've asked us to do. It's you who ignore us. It's you who don't respond to do your part when we do our part. And that's when God has to sit back and remind them that they can't expect to do religious activity and then expect God to respond to that religious activity when after that religious activity, they're treating people like trash. And see, there's a mismatch between what the people think about the world and what people think about spirituality. They don't get the way it works. And so God reminds them again and again throughout this passage that they expect him to respond to their religious activity while ignoring the way they treat people in the world. Let's put it in our context. You might say it like this. You might say that the things that people do and say on Sunday don't match up with the things they do and say on Monday through Saturday. That's what Isaiah is pointing out to them. Your religious activity cannot be placed in a silo from the way you treat other people. Read James 2:14 through 19, and consider this question. How does ritual worship, apart from obedience, leave worshipers empty and disillusioned? Now let's read verses 6 through 10. Let's see how God defines true worship. Isn't this the fast I choose, to break the chains of wickedness, to untie the ropes of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, and to tear off every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the poor and homeless into your house, to clothe the naked when you see him, and not to ignore your own flesh and blood? Then your light will appear like the dawn, and your recovery will come quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard. At that time, when you call, the Lord will answer. When you cry out, he will say, Here I am. If you get rid of the yoke among you, the finger pointing and malicious speaking, and if you offer yourself to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted one, then your light will shine in the darkness, and your night will be like noonday. Now, back in verse 5, God asks, is a true fast a one-day deprivation of food? Or is it more than that? Well, in verses 6 through 10, he explains to us what a true fast is and really, in a sense, what true worship is. And verses 6 and 7 are super important for us as followers of Christ because it says to us the things we do on Monday through Saturday are just as important as what we do on Sunday. Actually, it might be more important than what we do for that 1 hour on Sunday morning. Jesus reiterates this connection between worshiping him and living a godly life and treating other people well in Matthew chapter 22. In verse 36 through 40, he says this, Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the greatest and most important commandment. The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All of the law and prophets depend on these two commands. Now, with all that in mind, I want us to consider a practical activity. I want you to take a moment and go back and look at verses 6 and 7 and come up with 2 or 3 or 4 ways that you can live out these practices, these things that God is talking about in your daily life in the 21st century. I'll give you a few moments to consider that for the coming week. Now, let's read verses 8 through 10 in light of verse 3. Remember, back in verse 3, the people were complaining. They said, God, we're fasting, we're doing the religious acts, and you're not listening to us. You're ignoring us. And God says to them, you can't expect me to do good stuff for you if you're out there not doing good stuff for other people. In other words, I'm not going to just overlook the way you treat people just because you act nice to me. Let's be reminded that we are not talking about salvation here. We're not talking about justification. We talked about that last week. Here we're talking about the way a person who's been justified should be acting. When we come to faith in Christ, we do that only because God makes that possible to us through Christ. But after we come to faith in Him, there are expectations that we act a certain way and that we treat people a certain way. When we treat people the way these verses are asking us to treat them, we're treating them the way God treats them. We're treating them the way God treated us when we were in need of salvation. The verses say, the Lord will answer us when we cry out. He will say, Here I am. Let me ask you a question. When we gather together on Sundays to sing, who sees? When we share prayer requests in our small groups each week, who sees that? When we give on Sundays or during the week or when you plan your budget, who sees that? Well, other church members might see some of that. Other believers might see some of that. And God for sure sees that. But you know who doesn't see it? That's unbelievers. And actually, Jesus tells us in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, don't give loudly. Don't pray in the streets to be seen. Don't make an appearance of your fasting. He does that so that we're not tempted to do it for the wrong reasons. But he tells us here in these verses in Isaiah that when we act the way God instructs us to act, when we care for the poor, when we care for the downtrodden, when we reach out to the people in need, when we do those things, then the people will see us. But when they see us do it, they're going to see the Lord, and they're going to give honor to him. It allows them to see the God we sing to. It allows them to see the God that we rely on when we pray. We allow them to see the God that we depend on when we fast and when we give. Let's look now at Isaiah 58, 11 through 12. The Lord will always lead you, satisfy you in a parched land, and strengthen your bones. You will be like a watered garden and like a spring whose water never runs dry. Some of you will rebuild the ancient ruins. You will restore the foundations laid long ago. You will be called the repairer of broken walls, the restorer of streets where people live. All right, so let's remember that Isaiah is talking to a people who are about to go into exile. And in the process, he is reminding them that God is going to protect them. God is going to bring them back out of that land, back into their land. In the process, he's going to lead them in right living, and he's going to allow them to rebuild the nation. But let's read this in context of what we've been talking about before. What does right living mean? How is he going to lead them in right living? Is it just following practices, doing this and that from the law and doing this and that from the religious practices? Well, no, it's going to lead them in right living to care for others, to care for the downtrodden, to care for the destitute. In doing those things, he then will welcome their worship that takes place in the temple and through all of those practices that he outlines for them. So let me sum this up in my words, okay? Just a little bit. I'm going to dumb it down here for me so that I can understand this. My church attendance, my churchy stuff that I do, doesn't matter if I'm not treating others well. So if I want to love God, follow Christ, and care for others, if I want to do that, I need to live the way God's called us to live, and that is to take care of folks, to treat folks well. When we do that, our desire for worship will be satisfied. So let's recap and sum up with the challenge. Ritual worship, apart from obedience, displeases God and ultimately leaves worshipers empty and disillusioned. Meeting the needs of others in obedience to God brings honor to God. Satisfaction comes to those who obediently follow God. And a challenge you might want to think about. Maybe identify some roadblocks you face when it comes to being fully committed, fully obedient to God. What joys are you missing by not being fully obedient? How can knowing the potential joys help you overcome the roadblocks you identified? Well, thanks again for joining me for our study in the book of Isaiah. We have one more week in Isaiah. I hope you'll join me right here next week.